in the case of January 6th, there was probably over 100,000 people there. And some of those people were very violent. Some of those people were just there for a peaceful protest. So two things can be true at the same time. But the one thing that really they all did have in common is they were all there because they believed the election was stolen.
Welcome back to The Unknowns. We hope you'll be watching a new documentary that has been released by two of these gentlemen called Fight Like Hell. It's a fascinating documentary related to J6 and all the events that happened before that. So thank you so much, Jon Long, who's the director of Fight Like Hell, and also Ford Fischer, who is the co-writer and cinematographer of Fight Like Hell. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So give me a sense of this. I mean, you started way back before January 6th, sort of documenting some of these groups with Nick Fuentes, Roger Stone, Alec Jones, Ali Alexander. Did you expect at that time that this would turn into something like January 6th? Did your spidey senses tell you were onto something?
I personally had freelancers out covering from election night. So all across the country, and there's a brief montage in the film where you can kind of see this, that people were protesting even on election night. And then on the following morning, as people were protesting, saying, count every vote, concerned that Donald Trump was going to somehow interrupt the counting process. And then, of course, the second day after the election was that very first Stop the Steal event. For me, I felt this was very unprecedented, that you basically have, for the kind of the first time in American history, an American president who is contesting the results, it taking so long, as well as these, two movements that are that were beginning to form from that early on. Of course, one of those movements was rendered kind of moot, the count every vote, because, of course, the votes were counted and then, the process proceeded. But the Stop the Steal movement grew exponentially so quickly, from a couple dozen in the first couple of days to the Million MAGA March, which drew tens of thousands of people all the way up, of course, until January 6th. I don't think anyone could have predicted exactly how January 6th would have gone, but to me on the ground, it was certainly obvious that there was sort of an ascending tension during that time period.
Jon, as a director, how many hours of footage did you have to look at, review to decide what gets in, what gets out?
Well, I actually picked up on the story, although I was watching it unfold the months leading up. I sent crews there after seeing the tweet from Donald Trump, will be wild tweet. So I sent a few crews at that time. We were there for the week of January 6th, and then we went back again for the inauguration. And the cameramen that I sent both had like Hollywood-style cinema cameras, so we got this kind of footage. I don't think anyone else has really captured that type of footage. And then after the fact, about a year later, we just started to make a film, and I reached out to Ford, who had been covering everything up until that point in time. And then we began our research process of collecting all of Ford's footage, our footage, and other cinematographers' footage. And it ended up being literally hundreds of hours of footage that we went through. Our first compilation of the film was over 5 hours. We didn't know what to do. Should we make it a series? Should we make it a film? And we thought the most effective way to tell this story would be in a 90-minute film. And we set sort of ground rules for ourselves that we wanted to do something that was observational. We didn't want to go back and do a bunch of interviews with people to ask them their opinions about what had happened. We really wanted to create an observational film that started on November 2nd, the day before the election, and ends on January 7th. And so we just follow the events on the ground chronologically during that period of time. And we don't try to address what's happening behind the scenes that someone on the ground wouldn't see, like what's happening with lawyers in the White House or that type of thing. So that's the film we set out to make.
Were you surprised when you got the footage about what you saw, when the narrative started to develop? What was sort of you like, oh, we might have something here?
Well, I mean, immediately, because of the type of equipment we have and the cameraman that I was working with, our footage is just, it looks more like a Hollywood movie. So we knew we had something. We just didn't know what to do with it. So it took a lot of research before we figured out how to actually tell this story in a compelling way. And Ford was such a huge part of that because he had been going around the country for the months leading up And I really don't know of anyone in the country who has a better understanding or who was there more than Ford. So his contribution and his experience really helped form the movie.
So let's talk about that, Ford. You seem to be on the ground earlier than anybody else. When the cameras stopped rolling, obviously you're around these people. Were there things you learned that made some of them just more human, the sense that they were just believing in something? Or were you just, how did you feel about the folks that were sort of gathering at all of these rallies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a variety of different types of people who were at them. And as John has kind of pointed out, I think this was really an observational project to see what those people would be seeing on the ground. And I think that you had a mix because, on the one hand, there was a lot of focus, including of my own, on sort of leaders of the various movements. So just to give some examples, there was Enrique Tarrio, who led the Proud Boys. Alex Jones and Owen Schroyer were sort of on the ground at these events, but they sort of lead and report for InfoWars, which was really a big propagator of the idea that the whole Stop the Steal movement was premised on. There was Ollie Alexander, who actually founded and organized many of the Stop the Steal rallies. And so there was a variety of certainly some people who were much more hierarchical, right? That kind of leadership role. But then there was a lot of just people, right? People who showed up on their own just because they kind of heard the call, either from as it was, Ollie Alexander, etc., or from Trump himself as it relates to January 6th. And what I would certainly say that you can see both on camera but also off is that there were a lot of true believers at the rally at these events. They certainly believed what the president was telling them, what InfoWars, their sort of media source, was telling them. A whole lot of different sources all kind of telling them the same thing, that sort of democracy is under attack, and you, by showing up at these events, might be doing something to restore it. And I think as that situation became a lot more desperate, as it became closer to being certified against President Trump, there was an escalating sense of desperation. And so being on the ground at those things, the idea, not necessarily that January 6th would take place exactly as it did, but the idea that this is a day that there's so much desperation and it's kind of a final stop for the election is how they viewed it, that things could certainly go wrong. And of course they did.
There were up to 62 different lawsuits filed claiming that there was fraud or deceit in the election. All of them were dismissed. 30 of them were based on the merits of that. Was there any sense as you progressed forward into that people started to not believe President Trump? Was there any sort of people fading away? And you're like, I think this was a legitimate election.
My experience on the ground actually was kind of the opposite. Almost every time that there was some sort of a step that was in the opposite direction, it almost caused them to double down. So although this exact moment isn't in the film, the Q shaman, who does appear throughout the film, this is a guy who came from Arizona. He participated in the Arizona Stop the Steal events. He also came to the 2nd Million MAGA March, as well as notoriously he stood at Mike Pence's chair on January 6th. I spoke to him on the morning of December 12th, and that was the same day. So the 2nd Million MAGA March took place at the same day that the Supreme Court rejected the case from Texas suing Pennsylvania over their election procedure, basically saying that the election was stolen. What the Q shaman told me was he was hoping that the Supreme Court was going to intervene. Maybe the Supreme Court will stand up for Donald Trump. And I actually told him, I was the person who told the Q shaman, actually they rejected the case. And he was surprised to hear that. I have this on video. And I was like, do you have any reaction to that? And basically what he said is, oh, wow, well, that just shows that even all the way up to the Supreme Court, they're all corrupt. Right. So like he went from having faith in them to they didn't do what he wanted them to do. Ergo, there must be something wrong with them. I think that loyalty to Trump as the highest truth really drove all of the things that you see on January 6th. And when you frame yourself in that kind of understanding, what would you do if you believed the election was stolen and there was no other recourse?
John, did you have similar experiences where you just kind of scratch your head?
It's a very diverse group of people when you go to even to a Trump event or any event, right? They're diverse. And in the case of January 6th, there was probably over 100,000 people there. And some of those people were very violent. Some of those people were just there for a peaceful protest. So two things can be true at the same time. But the one thing that really they all did have in common is they were all there because they believed the election was stolen. And the president said the election was stolen, and they believe that, so they were there for that reason. We were not there to try to debate them, or we were there to listen and try to understand where they're coming from, and just try to show that in a purely journalistic way, so people can just see as though they were there and come up with their own conclusions.
Do you have thoughts about just the sense that when people showed up on that particular day, Jan 6, I think 2,500 actually entered in the Capitol. And to your point, there were many people who didn't. Are there some arguments that they present that this wasn't an insurrection, it wasn't an attack, it was more of a rally? Are there some people that you met that you felt like that's what they were there for?
I mean, personally, having been on the ground there, I was there for the entire speech at the Ellipse, and it was thousands upon thousands of people. As John pointed out, more than 100,000 people who actually went to Washington, D.C., and then even by the DOJ's most kind of liberal estimate, like up to 3,000 people could be charged. Reasons to be charged for January 6th would basically include physical violence or vandalism or entering the building. And so even if you take those numbers kind of at their most extreme, it's a single-digit % of people who actually participated in that. I also think that a lot of what happened was not exactly expected. Even the people who brought weapons and so forth largely did so because they thought that they might be fighting anti-fascists or some kind of, leftist protesters. That was a lot of what the rhetoric was heated about leading up to it. And it's what most of the violence in the couple of months that preceded it actually was about, as opposed to them fighting the police, which did happen, including on January 5th, as you see in the film, although somewhat minimally. So I think that if you asked the mass of people, and I have had this conversation with people who were at January 6th but nowhere near the Capitol, to them the storming of the Capitol was a totally surprising outcome and not something that they would have participated in. Again, it can be true at once that there's lots of people who felt that way, and still thousands of people stormed the Capitol, and those two things are both accurate.
And there's a scene in the film on January 5th, late at night, where there is a lot of violence. So as a precursor, when you see that scene, it really is no surprise, in a sense, what happened the next day, because, there was people saying, you can't stop what's coming tomorrow. And so there was a lot of rhetoric that way as well. So again, two things can be true at the same time. There was probably people there that were there to be violent, and others who were there to be peaceful.
It is interesting. The violence at that event were not unique. We had spent a long couple summers with violence elsewhere in the country, and not to delimit anything that occurred on J6, which is any violence was completely unacceptable. Is the fact that it was the government institutions that people were entering into that sort of made it new and different, right? If that had occurred at a shopping mall or something like with the same level of violence. But what was unique about it, at least in your mind, while you were there and upon reflection?
I covered much of the violence that did happen over the summer of 2020, and sometimes I have seen this comparison be made where, for example, in Portland, there were attempts to break into or damage, for example, police stations or also a federal courthouse. So you could kind of superficially compare the two and say, oh, there's violence attempting to get into a federal courthouse. I think a very, very primary difference, though, which I do think that Fight Like Hell sort of demonstrates, is there was a proceeding going on, in a specific proceeding going on inside of the United States Capitol at the time that the riot was trying to get in, essentially with the intention of causing a different outcome of that proceeding or preventing the proceeding from happening. And indeed, the proceeding ended up taking place hours later, which did not have any substantial effect on who ended up becoming the president, but they did succeed in delaying it for a period of time and changing its outcome, although they changed it only a little bit in the opposite direction. There were some Republicans who had planned to object who no longer wanted to go along with it because they didn't want to be associated with the riot. The contrast I would present is that although there were certainly rioters over the summer who were going into or attacking buildings that were even institutions of government, I'm not aware of an example of them doing that specifically to stop, say, a trial that was happening on the inside of it. I think that makes a pretty big difference, and particularly because all of these politicians, including the sitting vice president of the United States and the incoming vice president of the United States, were on Capitol Hill at the time.
Upon reflection, many, many, many people were charged. Do you think all of those charges for those people were accurate, or was it too wide of a net? There's been some criticism that it went too far. I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that, and have you been tracking that as well?
I haven't been tracking that really deeply. I understand how many people have been charged and, for various things. I have not studied them individually. I would imagine that, some of them could be more or less overblown or underblown. I don't know. Like, certain people may have just got caught up in the moment and never expected to be in that moment and are paying a consequence for that. Again, there's just so many different people experiencing so many different things. So you have someone hitting a police officer over the head with a flagpole, and then someone beside them who's, a doctor or a lawyer or anyone who is right there but didn't expect to be there. And so it's a very complicated thing. We don't try to address that. I mean, that's another movie. That's another 10-part series right there that I think, should be done. We just tried to capture in context what was happening in the moment. And the way that we do that I think is much different, is by playing shots very long. So, for example, like the first breach at the sidewalk outside the Capitol of the West Entrance, they breached the perimeter fence, and then there was another set of bike racks, and then the fences at the foot of the Capitol. To breach all three of those fences took only 5 minutes, and our cameraman rolled for the whole 5 minutes. And because he's a cinematographer, he was actually composing his shot. So when you see these shots in context, it's a much different way to tell a story than showing a little snippet and then talking about that snippet for 15 minutes. It really allows you to just be in the moment, be there, and make your own judgments about what you're seeing.
Does some of the footage, security footage within the Capitol, sort of underscore, I think, what you were talking about, Ford, is like something could be true here and something could be true there? Because some of that footage feels like a school field trip in a way.
Yeah, so I've seen this point be made pretty extensively, and to your point, it's like different places in the whole situation are going to look different. I think that the most critical reason that that's the case is that the front line of a conflict is always where you're going to be seeing violence. Whereas in a specific moment where there's no conflict occurring, of course, it basically looks peaceful. So much has been made, for example, about, there was a moment that Trump supporters are walking, in the middle of the velvet ropes. And then they say, so therefore it was peacefully and orderly. But of course, there had to be breaching to take place to get there. And this has been reflected. It kind of circles back to the question you were asking about, like, legal outcomes. Individuals who basically ended up just entering and leaving the Capitol without personally participating in violence have generally made out with probation, at tops for misdemeanors, based on having kind of trespassed and having gone in because there was violence kind of to get them in, but without participating. And that stands in stark contrast to people at the front lines who fought their way in to sort of establish that kind of territory. So there is a vast difference of kind of tone depending on where exactly you're watching at any given moment. And I think that the film Fight Like Hell does a really good job of presenting the how, and the how is really the front line. So as much as you could sift through the 40,000 hours of security footage because of how many angles, of course, there were, right? You could make an entire movie about January 6th for 2 hours with no violence, but I think that would be pretty misleading as to how it actually occurred.
And to your point, Ford, as well, the scene that you described of people walking peacefully through those velvet ropes is in the film as well. So it's, we show that happening as well.
Former President Trump has obviously made J6 a part of his campaign, sort of the people that were indicted and convicted and jailed as sort of, people that will be pardoned. You were there on the ground. How do you sort of process that the very folks that were breaching could and might be pardoned?
So I've covered much of the movement that came kind of after January 6th over the past few years. I have, for example, interviewed the mother of Ashley Babbitt and these folks who are outside of the trials and the jail where people are detained. And they certainly take they really embrace when former President Trump describes kind of their situation and says that he will help them. There's kind of this almost like transactional, they're supporting him because they feel that he's supporting them. It wasn't like that in the very beginning. Like in the one day after January 6th, President Trump was saying, if you went into the Capitol and you participated in violence, you will be prosecuted for it. And his tune has changed a lot more, where he's sort of adapted a lot of their language by calling it like the DC gulag, for example, the jail in DC and so forth. So it definitely remains to be seen what President Trump would actually do.
How do we move from this pure fight that we seem to be in, this cacophony of noise and finger pointing? I know you all are journalists, but you got to have some thoughts on this. What are we missing in this debate so we can try to solve some of the issues we have?
Well, I think it actually happened on January 6th, after President Trump told his supporters to go home. The evening of January 6th, and after everyone was watching those images that had happened throughout the day, there seemed to be a transformation towards unity. So pretty much everyone who was outspoken at the time, whether it be media or politicians from either side, were saying, we need to come together as Americans. This political violence is unacceptable. And I really think, having that understanding, or that understanding amongst everyone, that we don't need to go to political violence. And I think that the only way to achieve that is to have empathy for people and communication, like talk to people, try to understand people, quit pointing fingers, like you say, and just be open-minded. There isn't 100,000 people there. They aren't all crazy people. They're there for a reason. If you have a conversation, you will begin to understand and find ways to come together.
Ford, any sense from your place in history?
Yeah, I would actually say that watching movies like Fight Like Hell, and the reason that I say that is because in the aftermath of January 6th, there's been so much media coverage and so many documentaries that attempt to assess January 6th in some historical fashion or another, and usually they have one of two purposes. It's either to vindicate President Trump, where you have movies like 2000 Mules by Dinesh D'Souza, who attempts to say that the election was stolen and more or less justify what happened on January 6th, films like that, or you have films on the opposite side who are using interviews after the fact to sort of place moral condemnation on Trump and his supporters. And so you almost have these two coexisting realities. There is one true reality of how January 6th went, and people are diametrically opposed to each other in how they're presenting them in the news and documentary. Fight Like Hell does something different by doing it observational and without that kind of judgment in either direction. And I do think that media like that, at least, even if there's going to be disagreement about it, at least starts you from a sense of shared reality. And so I certainly hope that we can see more projects like that going forward into the future.
Well, Jon and Ford, where can people see Fight Like Hell?
So it's free on YouTube in the United States. You can go to fightlikehellmovie.com, and that's our website, and click a button, and there you go.